Well, hello and welcome to the Radical World podcast. I'm Jose Leal. Matt Perez, my partner, is not here today, but we do have Dave Rosenberg. Dave is this pretty interesting person, having come from a background in the Navy, working in the world of coaching, world of consultancy, world of work. How do you work? How do we make work better? And doing all of this speaking around how do individuals and organizations do better at work. Dave, welcome.
No, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure being here.
No, it's a pleasure having you. We had David Marquet, the
Oh,
submarine.
yeah, yeah. Turn the ship around.
Yeah,
Know the book well.
absolutely. Great book and great individual. We really enjoyed that conversation with David. So we have a history of speaking to people who come from the military.
Yeah.
The interesting thing with David was that he basically sort of not only turned the ship around, I think he turned it upside down in the sense of how we think about leadership in the military on a submarine, right?
Well, you know what's interesting about that is certainly the culture in, I believe he was in Pacific Fleet, if memory serves me, at the time, that may have seen the case. But if you look historically at the truly great leaders in the military, and you could go all the way back to Alexander the Great and Philip of Macedon, the basic principles actually haven't changed. How they're applied has changed, but the basic principles hasn't changed. And what he did is, I won't say rediscovered, because he was actually inspired by one of his first skippers, right? But he did reinstitute that.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing new under the sun, and he did a brilliant job of it.
Yeah, and it seems to me that this radical world conversation that we've been having is consistent both with what he discovered or rediscovered, re-implemented, and I think what you are talking about in this world of radical accountability.
Absolutely. You go back to a total quality management. If you look at that, if you look at servant leadership, what they call servant leadership now, but the original title of the paper was Servant as Leader. It's the concept of empowering people to do their job and do it well. And how do we do that?
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about your background. Like, how did you get to this, and why did you get to this? And also, why did your wife make you grow your beard again?
Well, I'll answer the second question first. My wife made me grow my beard again because I'm ugly.
So now we have two things in common. We have no hair on top of our heads, and we need a beard to cover up our faces.
Right. Well, fortunately, God only made a few perfect heads, and the rest he covered with hair. And which is the same reason my face is covered with hair, right? Because the head might be perfect, but the face not so much. No, my when I met my wife, I had a mustache, but very quickly after we met, within months, I had grown a beard again. I was beardless in the military, of course, in the Navy, but most of my adult life I've had a beard. So I grew it back, and that lasted over 20 years. And then a couple of years ago, I decided to shave it, and she was like, ah. And for like 2 years, though, she'd wake up and scream. And so finally I got tired of that, and I just grew it back. So,
well, so many people we interview, we end up realizing that they're kind of in our generation, right? And so here we go.
Yeah.
Gray beards and bald heads.
Yeah.
So please, how did you get in? What's your background in the military?
So I joined the Navy in 1987. I was an engineering student. I graduated with a degree in engineering. It's interesting. I went into engineering without a clue what engineers did. I was good at math, and it was the pressure in high school. What are you going to do? Right? Go to college, get a degree. I'm like, spin the wheel, engineering. It was literally that. Well, not literally that, but it was a pretty random choice. I'm good at math. Gee, engineering sounds interesting. I have no idea what it is. But what I secretly I always wanted to be an astronaut. And I will tell you, that hasn't gone away. If in the middle of this interview, NASA opened that door, tapped me on the shoulder, and said, "We need you," this interview would be over, and I'd be on my way to Houston. Um, but a friend of mine in college said the best way to become an astronaut was through naval aviation. And I wore glasses. I've had the LASIK and stuff since then, but I'm like, I can't fly. I have glasses. And he told me about this program, Naval Flight Officer. So for those of you who saw Top Gun, and who hasn't, I was Goose. So that's called a Naval Flight Officer. You don't actually have the controls, but you do get to fly in various aircraft. And I got fortunate enough to actually get selected for the F-14. And I probably the most formative event in my leadership and adult life happened while an officer in the Navy. I was a legal officer, which is, I'm not a lawyer, obviously. I don't even play one on TV, but I was responsible for administering the Uniform Code of Military Justice. That's the law books that guide the military. And one of my responsibilities was to evaluate reports on sailors who were, misbehaving in some way and determine, either make a recommendation or a determination of what to do. And a young sailor who had just joined the squadron was in trouble for dereliction of duty. And that's a fancy word for saying he wasn't doing his job particularly well. And typically on the first offense like that, you just have a conversation, just like in business, right? You just have a conversation with the guy. And the problem I struggled with is, while I had literally years of training in how to fly and fight the F-14, I had 1 month of training in being a legal officer, and none of that included how to have this conversation.
Right. Which is true in business as well, by the way.
Oh, it's even worse in business, but yeah, you're absolutely right. And so, what am I going to say? And my dad was a school teacher. He taught in a neighborhood of Philadelphia where I grew up called Kensington. It's a terrible neighborhood. If you saw Rocky, I'm going to refer to movies a lot. If you saw Rocky, that took place in Kensington, generational poverty. And he had a pretty good record, better than average, of getting kids to connect with going to college, which was, most people, their highest aspiration was get a good union job so they could get, steady pay and good pay, et cetera. And the way he did this, and what he taught me, was that it's not enough just to tell people why it's important to them, because we'll let ourselves off the hook. But connect it to why it's important to other people. In other words, how are their actions affect others? We're anthropologically predisposed to support the tribe, right? Because if you think about when we were hunter-gatherers, if you're not part of the tribe, you're kicked out. If you're not contributing, they couldn't afford to keep you around as a deadbeat. Everyone had to contribute. And so we developed with this need to be held in esteem by our tribe members. Abraham Maslow, in his famed hierarchy of needs, he talks about this as the esteem level of need. And so when you connect people to how their actions affect others, get people to think outside of themselves, then they're going to be more predisposed to doing their job correct, because we don't want to let the tribe down. And so I had a conversation with him along those lines and sent him on his way. And frankly, I wouldn't remember this to this day, except for something that happened about 9-10 months later. We were on our way back from deployment, and we stopped in Hawaii like we always did on the way back to drop off the weapons. Our weapons don't come back here to San Diego, and pick up what's called tigers. In the Navy, a tiger is a friend or family member who's going to ride the ship back with you. And my dad was coming back with me. So he was going to go to work week, you think of it. When I picked him up, he was standing with this young sailor and his father talking. And, I said hi, introduced myself, threw my dad into my rented car, and we took off. And my dad looked at me as I'm pulling away from the curb, and he says, "Son, that sailor has a lot of respect for you." And I remember looking at him thinking, what are you talking about? He never worked directly for me. I knew him from around the squadron, but there were like 150 people or something like that in the squadron. I didn't know him. And he told me the story about how I counseled this young man. And then what he said to me is what cemented it. He said, son, he credits you with saving his career. That's when it hit me, the power of leadership, the power of words. We never know how our actions can affect others. And I mean, I see it today when I speak, and I think, here's this amazing point I'm going to make on stage. But what people hear is something else I said that is a throwaway line, but it's really impactful for where they are in their life at that moment. So we never know how our actions affect others. So I started implementing that in my career. Like you, I started a business, and then I went to work for other people. I ended up running 4 companies as president. And that was one of the things that I started to do, amongst others. And I started creating this framework for leadership, which turned into my first book called Locked On Leadership, and the name of my company. But the one piece that kept resonating with people was the accountability piece, where I was talking about how to have that accountability conversation.
Can I jump in there? Because
Sure.
I want you to define, well, no, I want to help you define leadership in a way that may or may not sort of fit within the radical world view of what leadership is. And so my question to you is, would leadership be more of a mentor or more of someone who is a guide, a telling you what to do kind of person?
The answer to that, so I mean, to me, that's not defining leadership. So let me first define my definition of leadership.
Fair enough.
Leadership is about assisting people to be the best version of themselves they can be in every situation.
Please say that again.
Leadership is about helping people be the best version of themselves they can be. When you do that, and you have a mission, we're talking business, you have a mission, something to accomplish, a purpose for the company, and you have the right people who will be excited, what Maslow called self-actualized, in your mission, and you help them obtain that self-actualization, which is being the best version of them they can be, they'll see that the mission is accomplished. Right? So a business strategy and leadership strategy are 2 separate things when we need both. And to me, the leadership strategy, the only leadership strategy, is help people be the best version of them. Having said that, to answer your question, as a leader, we need every tool in our belt. We need to be able to be transactional. We need to be willing to dictate when required, but we also need to be able to empower when possible. So what I tell my clients all the time is, as a leader, you have, it's a democracy. The company is a democracy, and you have 51% of the vote. So cast it last. Knowing that you have the ability to say, no, we're going to do it this way. There's no reason to start that way. Because in my experience, when I go to the team and say, here's what our goals are, here's what success looks like, here's what we need to accomplish, how do you want to do it? They'll almost always come up with a better way than me. If I went in there and told them how to do it, they're going to follow what I said to do and probably not do it as well as they would do it on their own. But sometimes you need to go in and say, this is the way it's got to be.
And how, because part of, we see from a radical world perspective that much of what's gone wrong with our society is that many people work in environments where they're just doing what somebody else dictates.
Right.
Right. You know, I walk in, my boss says, you're working the fryer today. Right. And that's not how you do the fryer. You got to do it this way. And you know, and so on and so forth. And so it becomes this, from the most menial job to, you know, being an officer in an organization that we have to follow whatever someone else is telling us what to do. Right. And it could be at a you know, an executive in a corporation. I've got a board, and the board says, you've got to turn the numbers around. and turning the numbers around by X. Go do X and do this in the way that we're asking you to do it. Focus on this business rather than focusing on that business, or open up this new line of business. Those kinds of things where it may not seem like someone's dictating, but they are, right? Please.
So we may disagree here on this, and so you mentioned as we were talking before the show about like holacracy, and I know I've interviewed executives over at Zappos Shoes who embrace holacracy and have since moved away from it.
Right.
So the one thing I want to call, in my worldview, right, it's not an either or. There's no polarity. Polarities don't exist. Polarities actually don't exist in nature, right? The very essence of matter, subatomic particles, embrace duality. Right. A quark is both a wave and matter and energy simultaneously, and all subatomic particles are. So duality exists in us. So it's not I either dictate or I let the other people, I empower everybody to make decisions. As the board of directors of a company, if we're going public large company, or as the owner of a privately held company, either way, it's your entity. Okay, you represent either the owners or you are the owner, and so the overall general direction belongs there. That's who has that power. Okay, and they have the absolute authority, right, privilege, whatever you want to call it, to dictate whatever they choose to, because they're sovereign. Does that mean that's the most effective way to make people? Empower people? Of course not. Is that the most effective way to elevate people to be their highest forms of themselves? Of course not. So if you want to embrace what I call radical accountability, and you call just radical world, that's not going to work. And they have the right to do that. Okay. So what tool do you need? There are also people who aren't ready yet. So in order to get people to be open to self-actualization, what Maslow has taught us is that the lower levels of needs must be substantially met first. So you have to meet people where they need. If I said to somebody who's never worked in an environment where they have free reign, you get to make decisions as long as they're driving to our goal, you're not going to get good decisions. They don't have the skill sets to do that yet.
Very true.
So you need all of it.
Absolutely. And I agree very much that you need all of it. What I was looking at, Dave, was that holistically speaking, right, we have a society where most people who are managers, right, they think their job is to dictate, not to support, not to empower, not to do radical accountability, as you describe, right? So I'd like you to describe more clearly what you mean by radical accountability. But I think for us, and my experience within organizations, I worked in a corporation where the CEO would walk in and say, "This is what I want done today with this story," right? Working in a newspaper where the CEO is walking in and saying, "I just got a call literally from Ford, and Ford wants us to pull that story, and I'm telling you, you're pulling that story."
Sure. And of course, why is he doing it? Because the number one revenue source for that newspaper is advertising, and Ford is a big advertiser, and I'm guessing that's the case, right?
Exactly.
And so he's looking at what's his motivation, what's the reason for being. So let's start there. So there's three elements to radical accountability, and I'll come back to reason for being. Mechanics, mindset, and model.
You froze for a second, Dave.
I'm back.
You froze for a second, so I'd like you to say that again.
Sure. The three elements necessary for a culture of radical accountability are mechanics, mindset, and model. Mechanics are the policies, processes, and procedures, training, everything you have in place to set people up for success so they know what to do, how to do it, and they have the confidence that they can do it. And that's metrics, all of that. The mindset starts with company. What's your purpose? No company exists to make money, because nobody is going to pay another company so that they can make money. They're going to pay another company to do something because they need help, and the value they're getting from that company is worth more than the money they're exchanging for that, right? So companies exist to fulfill a higher need for others.
Right.
The mindset of others is what I'm trying to get at here. And then within the organization, we have to have that mindset of how our actions affect both our coworkers as well as the other stakeholders, the customers, the vendors, the whole ecosystem. And then model requires that our leadership, those we see around us who, there is a hierarchy, are actually following the behaviors that they are espousing you do. So in your particular case, what's the mindset of the owner? I have to make money. And so now everybody is going to kowtow to that, which doesn't fulfill you. So now you start to shut down. It's like, I can't be self-actualized making money for somebody else. What that means nothing to me. And so that becomes anathema to creating a culture that we're talking about, where people eagerly and excitedly do what they're supposed to do when they're supposed to do it.
And I love your little framework there of those three things, because I'd like to dig deeper into each of those, if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
So the first is the mechanics.
Mm-hmm.
You need to know how to do something in order to be able to then execute when you're motivated to do it.
Correct. And even before how, first we need to know what, right? So really good, accurate job descriptions. What are you responsible for? Because, again, we go, I get the job to meet the basic Maslow's need of physiological needs. This is how we put food on the table. We all need that. So it's really important to me that I keep my job, right? Which is the safety and security level, which is where we're working here. And when you tell me you hired me to do X, I had a client once who hired a office manager, but the office manager's real job was doing bookkeeping. So the person he hired had skills as an office manager, but not as a bookkeeper. She was on shaky ground. So we ended up redefining the job because it's not really what they needed, right? So having accurate job descriptions, what is required, then having the training, how do I do it? What's expected of me? What are my metrics? And that training is formalized with testing. So when you finish the training, you have the confidence to know I can produce what I'm supposed to produce in the time frame you're asking me to produce it accurately, correctly. So now it's sort of like, I can do my job. Now I can focus on doing it.
I would frame that a little bit differently, because we talk about peer-to-peer organizations,
mm-hmm.
meaning that rather than thinking that I have somebody who's going to train me, that I have access to information that will help me learn what I need to do, what it is that I do, and which I wholly agree with you. What's my role? So I get to partially, not fully, but partially define what my role is along with my team, so that it isn't dictated to me as here's what we want you to do, but here's where you fit within what we need done. And that ability to collaboratively define a role, so that and to keep that role changing and updated. Because one of the things that happens is that we calcify a role, and tomorrow something else is needed, and I no longer have a definition for that. Who's going to do it? The job description doesn't change until, there's a step change a year later, 2 years later, where somebody says, well, we're going to give you a new role. But things have changed a lot in that period of time, right?
Yeah. And, this is really an interesting conversation. And I think in the right environment, that certainly will work, right? Can work with the right people. The challenge can be, though, that not everybody, in fact, very, very few people at this stage of the game are equipped to thrive in an environment like that. Anthropologically, we are pack animals that recognize a hierarchical structure. There's an alpha, a beta, all the way down to omegas. And when we get into an environment, this is where group dynamics really fits in, forming, storming, norming, performing, right? And that's people vying it out in that pecking order. Where do I fit in?
Right.
And how does that work? So if you have somebody who's not real self-aware of who they are, so you or I can walk into that, I think, environment and do okay, but other people, they need to be brought along. And
But we have to be careful when we model those things that you've just described, because we've come to find out that the alpha doesn't actually lead at the front of the pack when we're traveling in the case of wolves.
right.
It actually goes in the back to protect and to make sure that everybody doesn't drop off, that no one gets lost, and so on and so forth. Our view of the alpha as strictly the one that is threatening us from this centuries of really defining things from this place of, Darwin's the fittest. Oh, that's what happens when I do this.
Yeah, you're on a Mac. I know. I can do the same thing, right? It's not, there it goes.
There
Well,
you
no,
go.
it's just getting to, but we could do this.
So I think there's I agree with you. I agree with you in general, for sure, that most people are not ready for this. And we have to upscale the way we organize in a big way to help people get there. And I don't think we're going to transform the average organization to become what we're talking about, a radical organization, a radically accountable, or a radical world where most organizations are radical. That's not going to happen anytime soon.
I mean, look at the Zappos story. They, Tony Hsieh embraced a holacracy, hook, line, and sinker. There's some funny videos there where, when he first did it, where, the people, there's no managers, and people are going nuts because people don't know how to,
Right.
And even in holacracy, there's what do I call it? I can't think of the circle leader. I can't think of the term for it, right? But there's always somebody.
Lead link.
The lead link. Thank you. Yeah. Right. There's always somebody who has that ability to say, this is the way it's going to be.
Yeah.
Right? And that's why I say there's a duality that needs
Absolutely.
to be.
Absolutely. There's no absolutes, and that we could not agree more.
Absolutely. There's no absolutes. The only absolute is there's none.
So let's go a little deeper into the three again, because it's the what and the how in the case of the mechanics.
Correct.
And I couldn't agree more, because if it's not clear to me what I should be doing and how I should be doing it, then motivation doesn't work very well, because I get lost the second I'm motivated to do something.
There's one more piece to this, though, that's really subtle. If we want creative, right? We want people to be creative about how they think about things, how they approach things, right? We want that. That's how we evolve and expand and grow. Creativity works best with constraints.
Mm-hmm.
If you, I can't think of his first name, Hansen. He's an artist. Embrace the Shake is Phil Hansen. That's his name.
Right.
Phil Hansen did a fantastic. I mean, his whole program is built around this idea, because, as it sounds like you're familiar with him, but for our listeners, he was a painter. He's a pointillist, meaning he would paint with dots like Monet. And he did this in high school, and he did it so much that he developed a neurological condition where his hand would shake, and it was uncurable. And he was despondent because pointillism was his identity. And his doctor said to him, embrace the shake. And so he started, instead of doing points, doing these shaky lines because he couldn't make a straight line. And he evolved it from there, where he realized the more constraints he had put on himself, the more creative he became. So there is this balancing act between policies and procedures and how to do things that also drives creativity. But I want to circle back to your point earlier, too. At the same time, and I just had this come up with a client I'm working with, where they were like, well, we need to be more nimble. And I said, well, that means you need to have a policy and procedure on how to evolve, meaning there has to be a methodology. Healthy organizations grow through a healthy mechanism. Put that into business. So you're not locked into that scenario you were talking about where every 2 years there's a step and you're like, hey, an improvement. No, my job's changed. Let's change the description. Let's get together, figure out how we do this, but not when cells evolve randomly.
That's cancer.
Thank you. That's exactly the thought.
And what cells do is recognize their environment and evolve constantly, dynamically. And so as an individual and as a team and as an organization, we have to recognize that things are moving, things are dynamically changing, and those things are the constraints that we're living in, both what our capabilities are, what our market is, what our situation is. And when we don't understand that those constraints are actually beneficial to our behavior, and either we don't deal with them by adapting to them, or we ignore them completely, then we end up not being creative. So the motivation, what we've found out, back to research again, is that if you're asking somebody to put bolts in a car, more money works just fine to motivate you. But when we ask you to do creative things, more money actually demotivates you. So there's a lot of research around what motivation works when we're actually being asked to be creative versus simply being physical.
Yeah. So this is why I distinguish between motivation and inspiration. Those people conflate those two all the time, and those are very distinct and different in my world. They both can achieve the same result, get somebody moving in a specific direction. But motivation for me, my definition is external. When I was in college, I used to go rent horses in Bucks County outside Philadelphia. There's this Tyler State Park. It's a huge, beautiful, grass forested park. Right outside that was a stable, and I'd go rent horses. I didn't know anything about horses. I didn't know how to ride other than general concepts. And stable horses typically are nags that have been poorly ridden by people like me who don't know what they're doing, and so it's hard to get them to move. And I would have to give them the heel, and they would maybe go into a little trot, and then as soon as I'd stop, they'd stop. Right? That was motivation. One day I rented a horse named Skittles. Now, Skittles, when I first got on his back, he was all over the place. Getting him to move was not the issue. Getting him to move where I wanted to,
right,
that was a different story. So he was inspired. His desire to move came from the inside. I had to learn how to channel his inspiration in the direction I wanted to go. Right. So when you talk about people turning a wrench and you pay them more money, you're motivating them. And the moment that money goes away, that wrench turning slows down again. Right. How do we inspire people to turn that wrench?
So we use different language. I really like your language. Motivation, as in motivational research around what's called intrinsic motivation. I actually think a slightly different way, which is to say, well, actually a polar different way, which is to say that intrinsic motivation is what I think you're describing as inspiration, and that external or extrinsic motivation is actually force.
Sure.
Right? That we're forcing you to do this by the fact that you will not eat tomorrow if you don't do this, because we're going to fire you if you don't actually meet the targets that we're setting for you. And so linguistics, right? But essentially, I think we're saying the same thing. We're describing the same things using slightly different language.
That's exactly right. Adding the intrinsic, which turns motivation internal, right? That's what the definition intrinsic. It's internal. It comes from within.
From within.
Right, as opposed to extrinsic, external, from without. I just find it using the two different words for me, because I like to meet people where they meet, where they are, and not, I don't know when I first meet somebody. And so to say motivation and have to distinguish between intrinsic and extrinsic, I personally have chosen inspiration because I think that is synonymous with intrinsic motivational. I mean, obviously, inspiration could also mean like
To be inspired by someone else.
right, or to be well, but that still is internal,
Mm-hmm.
right? But it could also it could be inspired by God, right? So it could be
Right.
this sort of paradigm shift, like moment. That's also an inspiration. So again, communication is not perfect. If it
Yeah.
was,
No,
we wouldn't have this
absolutely.
podcast.
That's the beauty of language. I'm just cautious of the fact that we've got about 5 minutes. We try to keep it to around 40 minutes, and I want to go through both a little bit more detail on those 3 points, but also sort of a bigger picture on radical accountability and the work that you're doing. I know you're having some upcoming events as well in the next few months. So can you give us sort of a little bit of the bigger picture and then fill in the holes in that?
Sure. So mindset, and I kind of spoke about this before. Mindset is inculcating in the team the higher purpose of the company, why it exists, and hiring people who are inspired or intrinsically motivated to fulfill that purpose. And briefly, like I talk about plumbing, for example, and I talk to construction and plumbing contractors, right? Plumbers are responsible for the creation of civilization. Literally, without a sewage and irrigation, we would not have civilization today. And so how many plumbers, when they're hiring people, somehow build that into their messaging so people go like, wow, I'm part of this legacy and I can help, right? So what's your higher purpose as a company? And then making sure people understand how what they do on a day-to-day basis drives that higher purpose. You do that.
You've heard of that, the little story, the vignette of Kennedy walking through NASA and stopping a lady that was sweeping the floor, mopping the floor, and asking her what she does there, which was obvious. And she says, well, I help astronauts get to the moon.
Yeah. So interestingly enough, the story I shared earlier about that sailor, the reason he was doing a bad job is he was brought in as an electronic technician, but the first job we assigned him was as janitor in a squadron. So he was just going through the paces. And what I explained to him was how he is affecting the morale of everybody else. And we're getting ready to go to sea, and we were working long days. And so that changed for his mind. It's like, right. Wow, wait a second, this is more important than I thought.
That's beautiful. Thank you for that.
Yeah, so that's mindset. And then the model, in some ways, is the most important. All three of these must be present, but if you want to undermine everything else, then have the message, do as I say, not as I do. You must be the person you want your team members to be. They will never behave any better than you do. And so you have to, if I want my team members to grow and become self-actualized, I need to be on a mission to grow myself and to look at myself hard in the mirror and to become the best version of me I can become every single day. And if I succeed today in becoming the best version of me today, that just means tomorrow I have to become an even better version of me. And I have to continuously to do that.
As humans, we're pattern organisms. We just follow other patterns. That's all we do.
Right. And we're predisposed to follow the alpha.
Exactly. So. And when we say the boss is the alpha and the boss ends up being someone who goes around beating on people, then that's what we do to each other.
And worse than that, if you ever watch The Dog Whisperer, okay, with Cesar Millan, because it's so applicable. If the boss is the humans, the pet parents, right, and they don't assume that alpha role in a healthy, balanced way, then the pack, somebody in the pack is going to assume it, and they're not going to do it as well because they're not truly the alpha.
Right. Well, nor do they evolved to lead a multi species
right.
gang or group or whatever is the right way to frame that.
Right.
So I love the way that you're talking about that. Yeah.
Yeah, and then of course, for in the human world, in a business, what happens is somebody in the company, right, becomes that central alpha, and they're taking the company a different direction than the ownership wants to go. And now you have conflict, conflict, conflict. Now, there's nothing wrong with conflict. It's very healthy when it's very healthy.
Right. But you have to have that mindset. If it's within the mindset, then it's healthy. But
Correct.
if you're off on some tangent, then that becomes Dave, I feel like we're like sort of getting to the point where we really want to be talking, and we're running out of time. So tell us a little bit more about Radical Accountability as a book you're writing. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's going to be my next book, Radical Accountability. Hoping for a late 25 or early 26 release date on that. It's still in the work. And so, what I invite you to do is to join my newsletter, which is lockedonleadership.com/newsletter. And you'll know as the book gets closer to that. And also, I'd love your stories of accountability to add to the book. And as a gift, if you do that, by the way, I've got several resources available. There's a whole white paper, 20-page white paper on radical accountability you'll have. There's a self-assessment you could take that I've created. If you want my first book, Locked On Leadership, the Tactical Business Guide to Creating a Culture of Consistency, Courage, and Caring, which is really the primer anyway, there's a link there. I'll even, if you want a 30-minute debrief with me about what's going on in your business, happy to do that. The other thing, though, is in September, I'm going to have my inaugural, I call it Command Expedition, Leadership Lessons from Iconic Battlefields. We're going to London to look at the Battle of London and how Churchill led and how Eisenhower led for preparation for the D-Day invasion. There'll be more information coming out very shortly on that. So join my newsletter, and that's going to be a small select, no more than awesome. 10 people.
That sounds like
trip. So
you're really developing a conversation around this radical accountability. And I like that little framework. It's a simple way of doing it. Part of why we're doing this in Radical World is recognizing that there are people around the world like yourself that are, as you said, nothing is new under the sun. And yet we keep getting lost as a society and as businesses and as leaders in modeling the wrong things and then having other people follow those models of the things that we shouldn't be doing. And I think radical accountability, radical world, the idea that we can have a way of working, a way of leading that is in keeping with our biological processes of serving life, serving each other, serving one another for the sake of building and evolving a better world, a better society.
Well, that's why my mission is to mobilize radical accountability and to create a global movement.
So and I think we just have. So thank you very much for that. And I look forward to working together, because I think we're talking about the same thing and figuring out ways to help one another with these communications. You mentioned the newsletter. There's the link to the newsletter. Thank you for that, Carlos. And we've kind of reached our time, Dave. Maybe it's worth bringing you back in a few weeks or a few months and continuing this conversation, because I think there's something there for us to explore.
I'd love to come back. It's funny, you're reading my mind. So it's like you're my brother from another mother.
Let me let our audience know that we don't have a guest yet for our upcoming week, but that should be happening soon. So stay tuned, take a look at the website, and we'll be able to inform you of who's coming next week. More and more, we're having conversations with people like Dave, as well as folks in the cooperative movement space future of workspace. All of these are conversations that we want to continue having as a community of folks that are all seeking to make our world better and a radical world for all of us. So thank you very much, Dave, for joining us and for spending time with us here today and for continuing this conversation and the work that you do. Yeah, absolutely.
It's been my pleasure.
The conversation
Thank you.
and love the ease with which we can have this conversation. So I appreciate that. Dave Rosenberg, appreciate it, and we'll see you next time.